Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Beautiful Fantasy Game Podcast, where we take a look at the building blocks of the Fantasy Premier League. The official FPL game launched in 2002, which means this past season marked its 19th campaign. I remember when I turned 19. Well, I don't remember much about the actual birthday. That part's still a bit of a blur. But I do remember being 19 and thinking I had everything figured out. And I have that same naive optimism as I enter each fantasy season. The first thing we need to establish is what Fantasy Premier League is. The simplest answer is that it is the official fantasy game of the English Premier League. The league created its own game that lived on its own website, and they got the idea and concept from the fantasy game's rise in popularity during the 1990s, when the game was mostly played through newspapers and magazines. Remember those? Going back even further, though, Bernie Donnelly is commonly credited with inventing fantasy football in 1971 by starting a league with 7 of his mates. The game has certainly evolved since then, and I'll be making another podcast to discuss the history of fantasy football itself, one that highlights the influence and impact of American fantasy football, which, despite being primarily played in North America, is the most popular fantasy sport in the world, with an estimated 60 million people playing, according to the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, which means we are still only scratching the surface with FPL. There is one main difference between Gridiron Fantasy and the popular FPL game. That is that the same rules applied to everyone instead of different leagues being played on different sites. So instead of just playing with your mates, you're competing with absolutely everyone. Each manager gets to build a team of Premier League players and accumulate points based on their players' statistical performance during each game week. This is a little different from typical North American fantasy sports. Instead of drafting players in a mini league of 10 to 12 teams and then going head-to-head against your buddies, you are building a lineup with players that have been given a value and you must stay under a salary cap. So there's a good chance that most fantasy managers will have the same star striker, but the real thrill of the game comes when you select someone that no one else is even thinking about and they come up with a haul, which is a term to label a return of at least 10 fantasy points in a game week. And a player that isn't commonly selected would be deemed a differential. This is making me think it might be worth doing a podcast on the terms and jargon commonly used in FPL. But that's not what this episode's about, so let's get back to the Fantasy Premier League origin story. In 2002, the official FPL game launched with no more than 76,000 managers fighting for a chance to be the first champion. That honor went to Graham Haddow, a Newcastle supporter from South Africa, and proud manager of Wee Woolly Winky FC. Triple WFC finished the season with 1,940 points, which is, not surprisingly, the lowest total by a winning manager in the history of the game. The highest total is from the most recent season. 2020-21 winner Michael Kuhn's Teddy Bear United finished with 2,680 fantasy points, capturing the title with a 5-point margin and beating out more than 8 million people who played FPL that season. The number of people playing FPL increases each year, and that pattern should continue for years to come. The point totals for the actual players in the Premier League remains relatively consistent through 19 seasons, though. The top fantasy player usually scores in the mid-200s. The only player to ever crack the 300 threshold is Mohamed Salah, when he burst onto the scene with Liverpool in 2017-18 and scored 303 fantasy points. Safe to say he was essential that season. Now that the Fantasy Premier League is entering its 20th season, the game and FPL community is proudly strutting with the confidence and exuberance you'd come to expect from someone in their 20s, with most managers feeling they've gained enough experience to finish in the top 10,000 in the world. But if life in fantasy sports has taught us anything, it's that you should learn to expect the unexpected and appreciate the journey instead of getting caught up on the destination. But that sort of wisdom doesn't come till you hit your 30s. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode and abbreviated look at the history of FPL. Enjoy the rest of your day and try not to stress too much about your fantasy decisions. Until next time, take care.